I am Nicole Gonteric. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm in New York, so I'm on Lenape land. And just for the visual description, I'm wearing a yellow shirt. I have brown hair. I'm a white woman with a blank white wall behind me. Nothing too special over here. But I'm a student at NYU studying media, culture, and communications. I was a climate ambassador last year, and it was a great experience. And I'm very excited to be a part of this breakout session. Also, excuse if you can hear my computer like humming. It overheats greatly. But I want to thank you, Ali, for being here, and thank you for this panel and answering our questions. You were just talking about, like how diversity and like racial inclusion is directly tied to climate action. So, and more companies are creating DEI initiatives. So how do you think climate storytelling can intersect with DEI initiatives in the entertainment industry?
I mean, I feel like to start out with, the reality with, most large industries taking any sort of action is there is usually this catalyst that they cannot ignore. The reality is, like, the entertainment world should have been more at the forefront of DE&I and racial justice initiatives for a long time, but it really was not until 2 summers ago that all of a sudden, and like I experienced this firsthand being at a development company where people all of a sudden, like for like a lot of the company I was at, their mission was focusing on like having diverse voices, really, putting their money where their mouth is in that way. And we were getting calls from other production companies being like, oh man, now we have to change our entire slate. Like, I can't believe that I have to figure out how to find all these new writers now. Like, all this stuff that people should have already been thinking about. And it was like extremely frustrating, and still is, honestly. I think we still have a really long way to go in that space. But for me, I feel like if these companies are saying that they really care about DE&I initiatives, they need to be caring about climate as well. If they are not putting their money and their effort into climate spaces, they are not helping the people that they are claiming to help with those DE&I initiatives, because the reality is the people who are going to be first and foremost affected by climate change, and who already are to a really large extent, are the global majority. That is completely obvious and studied, and we cannot ignore that. So if we're starting to put all of this collective effort into these DE&I initiatives, but we're ignoring climate, you are like inherently not helping those people that you are trying to help by hiring them into these spaces. And I could rant forever about, how those pipelines are still really messed up, even with these initiatives. But that is kind of my rant for now of how those two things intersect.
Amazing. Yeah, I totally agree. So another question is, as a writer yourself, how do you navigate power, like especially within a writer's room? How do you speak to people who are much higher up the totem pole in a writer's room if you're maybe not as high up the totem pole?
It is complicated. I think it first and foremost has to do a lot with the reality. I think a combination of two things. First is like the acknowledgement of your privilege. Like, do you have the privilege to speak up in those spaces? Do you have the privilege financially of being able to say something and risk having it go badly and getting fired? There's a lot of people in this industry who they cannot risk not having that job by saying anything, and that is completely valid. But if you have the privilege to say something in those spaces, people should be trying to say what needs to be said. But I think to get into it more specifically, it also depends a lot about the environment you're in. Like, is your boss willing to hear you out? Are the other writers in the room wanting to hear from assistants and lower level people? And I think it's about finding that balance of saying things, like kind of building your power within that space and starting out in small moments and saying kind of little small examples of how you might be able to integrate effective change within the ideas that everyone else is already having, without feeling like you are overriding writers and people who are above you. And over time, at least my experience has been, those writers start to trust those ideas that you're having and then look to you for that information, which is also like flip side of that, very frustrating, because if you happen to, like, for example, I identify as a queer woman. I have always, in every writer's room I've been in, which granted is only 2 so far, but also generally in the majority of companies I've ever worked for, have been the only queer woman in that space. And it often falls to me to be like, this is what being a queer woman is like in this TV show world we're creating, which also is like very frustrating, because obviously I cannot speak for literally all queer women. I can only speak from my perspective. And I am a cis white woman. So it's like, you know, there's like a lot of like caveats to what I'm saying, and it can be frustrating being that only voice in the room. But I think when it comes down to really advocating for environmental change, weaving those smaller moments into your storytelling doesn't have, like, those moments apply to literally everyone, no matter who you are. And of course, the way that you're affected by climate change really depends on your reality and your identity and your privilege. But interweaving any of that is helpful, because we are all affected by the reality of climate change. That was like I feel like a lot of things go into that answer, but I think saying something is really important, and you may think that you don't have the power to say something or it won't change anything. But even getting one idea across that shifts that narrative, especially in a writer's room, when ideally, if your show moves forward and it's on the air, then gets disseminated to like globally for the most part, that one idea really can make a difference. And it's important that you said that, even if it's scary, even if it's hard, even on the surface, if like your boss and everyone ignores you and thinks that what you said, you're going to immediately think that what you said was horrendously stupid. That's how I've always felt. But it really does end up like shifting that narrative over time as you continue to mention those things.
Yes, I think that's great. And I think that it also really ties into what you guys were saying in the panel about, you know, you can really make an impact even as an employee where you think you might not have as much influence. Just a small comment or something could actually transition to something more, and could actually be something that snowballs into a larger impact. Yeah, so I think it applies to even beyond the writer's room in that sense. So this is a very general question, but how do you think the entertainment industry can improve or create environmental initiatives? Very open-ended, but take it where you will.
Oof, I think, I mean, there's so many different places where that could start or stem from.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as I mentioned, like a lot of where I focus on that stemming from is in the development and writer's room space, and kind of the power of those stories and the power of those stories to create worldwide like cultural change, and how we have so many examples of how the industry changes culture in a lot of different ways and in a lot of different facets. But I think so much of it is kind of, and we mentioned this in the panel, and I feel like it is sort of starting to get across that this is the idea, but how do I like frame this in it? So it's like when you think about COVID and like what Lena was saying, what Smiley was saying, that the second COVID happened, it was so monumental and so effective in a negative way, obviously, that the industry immediately had to take action. We had to figure out a way to keep productions going. We had to get PPE. We had to create COVID compliance officers. We had to do all these things. And like Lena was saying, like, why is it's still such a small portion of the budget that is put towards environmental and like sustainability resources on set? To me, it is like the same. I think a lot of people within entertainment, and especially on the development and storytelling side of things, especially like the producers that are overseeing that versus necessarily like the writers who are creating that content, don't see the telling of those climate stories as essential at this point. Like to them, because they have a lot of privilege in this space for the most part, they have not hit a crisis point with climate change in the way that so many of the rest of the world has. Whereas like COVID was this undeniable crisis point. Like we had to address it. We were forced to address it. And the reality is like we have been forced or should have been forced to address climate change in the same way for a really long time now. But I think it is only now just starting to trickle into spaces where everyone realizes they're going to be affected by it. People are losing money because of it, et cetera. So I think like a lot of people filter out that information automatically when you're putting these sustainable moments in stories, because they're like, oh, this feels extraneous to the story that you're trying to tell, or it doesn't feel like it is woven into the incredible story about a mother and daughter that we're supposed to be telling right now. But the reality is, if we all think about it, that every moment that we're existing for a long time now and moving forward is perpetually affected by climate change, even in these tiny ways that we are not fully realizing, because they're not affecting us in this like, oh, we must stop everything and readjust in the way that COVID forced us to. So it's like, I think we need to start thinking about climate and the way that we discuss it in our storytelling and moving forward as like, this is an essential topic, and mentioning it in these kind of more grounded ways within every story we tell is not extraneous. It is not like weaving us away from the story. It is part of the story we're in. And like, we need to acknowledge that.
There we go. Couldn't get my mic for a second. But yes, I totally agree. The section where you guys talked about comparing COVID to the climate crisis, I thought I don't know why I didn't correlate in my head future. It's obviously it's the same. It's a crisis. Just one is more obvious than the other. But another question about climate storytelling is because sometimes climate storytelling can be a little polarizing. So how can you advocate for climate action in your storytelling that draws people in rather than makes them further polarized?
I think like my initial response, which is probably an annoying one, is who cares if it's polarizing? I'm like, we are like in such a crisis point that I'm like, yes, let's fuck some shit up. Like, let's make people think differently. Let's like, you know, it's like, I think what is considered polarizing to a lot of people who are, what people think is polarizing is because they are comfortable. Like, they are comfortable in the space we are in now and are not acknowledging the lack of comfortability for a majority of everyone else dealing with climate change. So this idea of these putting these things in or discussing climate change or having that be radical, I think is not acknowledging the crux of where we're at. I do think the flip side of that, though, is that telling apocalypse stories or like world ending stories, no matter how much in a lot of ways I find them very entertaining to write, are not the effective way to talk about climate change. So really interweaving things into like everyday moments that really hit home. Like, for example, I was in a conversation. We had Dorothy Fortenberry come talk to the Young Entertainment Activist Group. This is like towards the beginning of the pandemic. And she told this story about like, what if you had a movie that was about, I don't know, a family on a small farm, and over time, like every season, the family had like a small pond on their land, and every season their kids would go ice skating on the pond, and they've been ice skating on this pond for generation. And then one year the ice never freezes. And like, how does that affect how they experience their winters, how they experience their family moments, the fact that they can no longer go ice skating, even though it's a tradition. And I think like that may not seem devastating on this like global level, but it's devastating individually. And those are the stories that often really move us, like those really grounded emotional moments where you're like, oh, this life that I thought was really stable and this thing that I felt was really centric to my identity has shifted. And that doesn't always need to be like an explosive thing. And then it also just doesn't need to be like a radical thing to infuse those. It's like, that doesn't have to be the whole story. The whole movie could be about, I don't know, that the farmer is, I don't know, something awful. Their tractor broke and they have to raise money for a new tractor. But it happens to be a subplot that they can't go ice skating. Like, and I don't know, maybe this all sounds ridiculous, but that really hit home for me. So I was like, oh, that like tiny moment, like that would really affect me as like if any of those things that I really held dear in like a traditional familial sense, all I think highlighting that transition happens gradually. I mean, a lot of climate change does not happen gradually. And like, I think a lot of those same stories could focus on a hurricane hitting Louisiana or something like that. But I think it's kind of going through the motions of doing really heightened climate stories, but are not focused on like the disaster of it, with like grounded little moments mixed into everyday content. I don't know. Does that make sense?
That definitely makes sense. Also, sign me up for the Broken Tractor ice skating movie. I'd love to watch.
Thank you.
Just in case there is, I don't know if it's the same 8 or 9 people who have been here, or maybe people are in or out, but I just want to remind everyone, if you want to write any questions in the chat, feel free. You can, I think you can like ask me to turn on your video and your audio if you want to ask it out loud, or you can put chat only, but also I will keep asking questions too.
Yeah, so put things in the chat.
Yeah. In the Q&A, there's questions. So sorry. Okay, I will read them now.
Joey! I know the people in this chat.
well, hello. So he said, Joseph, do you want to come on? I can try and turn on your video. No, okay. I'm just gonna read it. Sorry, Joseph, if you wanted to read out loud. But he said, you mentioned getting into climate work partially through dystopian sci-fi stories. And he's curious about your thoughts on dystopian versus utopian fiction in affecting large scale and real world change.
Ooh, okay. So this is going to get like this is a really good question. And I feel like might get a little like academic, because I took a class about the different phases of the environmental movement in college, and my final project for that class was studying utopias versus dystopias, and my ultimate conclusion was that all utopias are dystopias and utopias don't exist. So that is like my very general answer, is like whatever, any moment. And I think part of this is because most utopias exist in a world based on the ideas of a singular person or only a couple of people, like or even like utopias that are set up in like a socialist utilitarian way are often like underhandedly controlled by like 2 or 3 people, or like one person who ultimately like ends up becoming a dictator, and then you realize that the utopia is like an awful place to live and you have to escape, which is obviously the trajectory of like 90% of dystopian movies that we watch. So that is part of the complicated answer, is that in my mind, utopias just are non-existent, because they may seem like the greatest thing ever for like 2 months, and then they always devolve into something, because you realize that as an individual, you don't agree with that person who's like leading the rules of the utopia. And I think that kind of filters down into like a very complicated discussion about society that we don't have to get into. But I think I'm kind of biased, because I love grounded sci-fi in the sense of like The Leftovers, or if you haven't seen Years and Years, that is like one of the best grounded sci-fi shows I've ever seen. It really, I mean, it's so real. I ended up like sobbing at every episode, because I was like, we're in this world already, even though it's supposed to be like a couple of years from now, aka Years and Years. But I have always, I think dystopias are really impactful, but they're impactful from a product of fear rather than hope a lot of the time, except for like, obviously your main character ends up like persevering through all the crazy dystopias, and then they find another reality and you see the glimmer of hope and the sun rises over the horizon and like everyone's kind of happy even though things still suck. And I think in a lot of ways that does sort of reflect real life, but I think it has been really shown that dystopias and that fear it creates is not what causes people to create action. Instead, it is what causes people to become apathetic, and that is not what we need right now in the climate movement. And so I feel like dystopias will always have a place in my heart, and I think they're really fascinating, but I think the type of storytelling we need now that will cause impactful change is showing people on screen making those impactful changes themselves, even if it's in small ways. That has been shown to motivate people who are watching to do those same actions or say, oh, wow, that person's doing that, so I can too. And those tiny individual actions, as we mentioned, may seem small. And like, you know, I personally believe in the whole, like, if everyone does 100 things imperfectly, it is better than everyone doing one thing perfectly in terms of like the environmental movement. But that all circles back to like, we really just need to like vote on policy and vote out politicians that are controlling like all of these giant oil companies and everyone, those top 70 companies, no, 100 companies that are causing 71% of greenhouse gas emissions. Like we really need to, obviously they're the real problem, but I think showing these individual narratives is still very impactful. I feel like it's a complicated answer. Sorry if that did not fully answer your question, Joey, but I would love to talk to you about it another time.
That was amazing. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Sean. He just asked a question. I don't know if you want to come up, if you want to speak about it, or I can say it. I'm not seeing any requests. Oh, here he is. Let's see. There you go.
There we are. Can you hear me?
Yep, can hear you.
Yes.
Hey, Ali. Hey, Nicole. Thank you so much for all the information that you're providing. I actually had a chance to look at your ambassadorship link, and I was curious just to learn more information in terms of who it's for and how long does it run and what the capacity is. I just wanted to get a sense of the program.
For sure. So I will, I guess, start off with saying like this program is still very much so in development, which is why we would love everyone to fill out that survey so we can get a better idea of what section of the industry everyone is coming from. We also are very happy to have people who are not in entertainment join, and we'll try to, we have focused it in on entertainment, obviously, because that is just kind of where our niche is. And so we're like, okay, we can provide that like that structure for those people because we work with them already. But we really do eventually want to expand this to say like, oh, you're in any office environment, you can apply these tools and these leadership skills to those spaces too. It doesn't have to be entertainment oriented. But for now, we are kind of like collecting that data. We're getting everyone's information on like an email listserv, and then we're planning another event in November-ish to really kind of like solidify a conversation between everyone who is interested. And ultimately, like this will be, we are planning a curriculum of like trainings that sort of start out with like sustainability, environmentalism 101, like what are these terms we're talking about? What are all these things? Because I think that's like the best place to start, since a lot of people very understandably are just confused by it or don't have that kind of solid base level. And then from there, we want to build out having sessions on sustainable storytelling and bringing in those really incredible people that we are connected with, like Dorothy Fortenberry, like a lot of people who are at the center of that reality, along with bringing in everyone we have in the production space to come do sessions about sustainable production. And ultimately, we're going to be weaving in leadership skills and like leadership sessions so that you know how to advocate for those things within your workplace. So in a lot of ways, it's targeted towards not the upper level people in Hollywood, but more so training people who consider themselves to not have as much power in Hollywood to say, oh, you do have the power to do something in the space you're in, and have that like trickle up to those upper level people almost.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's fantastic. I know I saw under categories like various fields in entertainment, but I didn't see actors. So I was like, oh wait,
oh my God.
Yeah,
I will add that. I'm so dumb. I also am an actor. I also.
Okay, there you go. There you go.
How did I not choose that? Okay, I will add that. Thank you for bringing that up.
Fantastic. Thank you, and that's very helpful. I know that's part of the issue for me is like I'm an actor with roots as a filmmaker and writing and developing content right now in the scripted space. But really having a full understanding of the issues is what's important when you're writing stories about climate change. It's like you want to tell a good story, but you also want to make sure that it's accurate and relevant. And so there's that gap in the marketplace. So I'm glad y'all are fulfilling that. For anyone who's listening in, and you probably know about this too, I signed up for a training with the Climate Reality Project, and they're having a big free training next month. And so that's kind of where I was starting. But I was really happy that you spoke about this. So I'm excited about it.
Yay. Thank you so much for asking that and for being interested. And we definitely will have more information on Sunday. Like we're going to be doing a longer, like 10-minute presentation on climate ambassadors. But ultimately, like we know all of like Climate Reality Project and all these other partners that we have on the summit this year, like we never have intended to be like, oh, we know all the knowledge that you guys know. Instead, we want to partner with all those people and like just kind of bring it into one space. So yeah, I'm so excited you're going to their training. That's awesome.
There's so much to know, right? Yeah. It's all good. Thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
See ya.
I just want to remind everyone before anyone goes or anything, there's another poll now in the polls tab that we'd love for you to fill out. And the last question, I think, is from Mary, I think your parents.
That is my mom.
Question, isn't it to Hollywood's advantage to fight climate change, because without it, Hollywood would only be able to shoot underwater? And I think this is a great question. I've been dying to ask.
Oh man. Thank you, Mom, for bringing that up. I think my first pessimistic answer to that is some people are so unwilling to acknowledge climate change and create any sort of action that they would rather develop every piece of camera equipment to be underwater and exist in that world and make all of their movies underwater instead. Is part of it. It, of course, is obviously to Hollywood's advantage it's to everyone's advantage to fight climate change. I think it is not in the advantage of, I think a lot of people who have a lot of wealth are not seeing it that way because they are just not affected by it yet. And I think they are affected more so now, but like, I think there are just a lot of people who are like, why should I bother changing for this? And I think, unfortunately, a lot of those people will not be moved to change until, like I was talking about earlier, it really hits like such a global level of crisis that it is undeniable. But I will say that a lot of, like, I am on lots of notes calls with studios and networks. I'm like listening into these very powerful people talk about all these ideas, whether it's about climate or racial justice or any of these things, queerness, etc. We still have a really long way to go. And even though these companies have outwardly said that they support these ideas, they are not putting their money into those spaces. They are not actually changing their content as much as they need to be. They are still, in a lot of ways, doing the bare minimum or putting like band-aids over bullet holes to look like they're doing something trendy in these spaces rather than really addressing these root causes. And that's why it's really important to build that momentum and have employees talk about it and have people insist that this is the way it needs to be. And I think a really great example of that right now is what's going on with IATSE. And like that, it hits very close to home. I have been an assistant for 4+ years now at various rising levels because it takes forever to become a TV writer. And, you know, I think it really has gotten to a point where the only way we can get these people to realize that something needs to change is by having them realize what it would be like without us. And of course, IATSE is not just assistants, but I'm very involved in the writer's assistant, script coordinator space. But I think something similar, like, I don't think we've had that gravitas with climate yet. And we need to figure out, like, what is that big thing that is going to move upper level people in Hollywood to really support this action. And I do think, like, supporting it in a superficial way is better than nothing, but it really needs to be taken many, many, many steps forward. And I think, like, it's very hard to not think of it as intertwined with what's been happening with racial justice in Hollywood and these DE&I initiatives, both because they are intertwined intrinsically and systemically, but also, like, you can kind of follow a similar trajectory with it, that it really was not until like 2 years ago that all of a sudden that became a crux of a lot of what was going on, a lot of the content being created, a lot of people discussing it, etc. And we need to get to that point of similar discussion within climate. I feel like I lost my train of thought there a bit, but I guess my full answer is, like, people all the time are like, oh, Hollywood is like making really big changes, don't you think? And I'm straight up like, no, like, they are making some changes, but we have to, like, push forward and push past that. And not to be pessimistic, I think there is a lot of hope. Everyone, like, I literally started crying this morning. So I was like, oh my God, people are actually at the summit and commenting and, like, engaging this. Like, we, you know, knew that this was important, but, like, to see people actually having these conversations is so moving to us who have been planning this for, like, months and months and months. And, like, that, even those tiny, like, actions that give people hope, commenting, adding to the chat, asking a question, like those are the things that like as they build, like that collective action is what's going to push those Hollywood movements forward. But I do think we still have a really massive amount of stuff to do. But it's getting there. And I think that's really important.
I think that's an amazing note to end this on.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for speaking with us and sharing all of your knowledge. It was so great to speak with you and listen to the panel. Thank you everyone for attending this little breakout session.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you have any more questions, everyone, I think you can like DM me or whatever on Hopin. Also feel free to reach out on LinkedIn or Instagram or whatever. I am more than happy to have these discussions or network with me. I'll be in the networking sessions. And thank you so much, Nicole. I'm really excited that you were a part of CAN at NYU. That makes me so happy.
It was a great time.
Yay. Yeah. So yeah, everyone, please, if I didn't get to answer your question or you want to talk about things more in depth, please feel free to reach out to me.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for listening.